afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves through consultation round 2 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities or are of community importance. So we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. With me today is my usual co-host, Jennifer Ashawezigai Pereira, my colleague and an Indigenous engagement and traditional knowledge specialist at Atkins Realis. Jennifer is a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, located on the French River south of Sudbury, and works with me on our projects across Canada. So let's get started, Jen. Today's
All
topic
right.
is how Indigenous knowledge, or IK, is used in environmental and impact assessments. And like all of our topics, we think it's important to discuss these and share that discussion with our viewers and listeners. So why don't we move forward with our first slide, and that will summarize today's topics, I guess. As usual, we're going to lead off with a bit of a project background to get everybody up to the same level. Then we're going to remind everyone what Indigenous knowledge is, and then get to the core of the presentation, which is how IK contributes to EAs and IAs by providing some real actual project examples. And then we'll talk about how you can get in touch with us. So let's start with the purpose of the Webequie Supply Road, or the project location, sorry. Webequie First Nation is located about 250 kilometers from James Bay and Hudson Bay. And a supply road runs southeast from the airport in the community, or will run southeast from the airport in the community to the McFalls Lake area, which is in the heart of the Ring of Fire, east of the Mukatai River. In terms of the purpose of the Webequie Supply Road, uh, there are three main purposes. The first being the movement of materials, supplies, and people along the road from the airport to the mineral development area, the Ring of Fire. The second is to provide employment and economic development opportunities in general to the Webequie First Nation, while allowing community members to preserve their language and culture and continue to live in their community, which is important. And then finally, providing experience and training opportunities for youth to help encourage the pursuit of additional skills through different types of post-secondary education. In terms of the project itself, uh, it's planned to be 107 kilometers long, the road itself. 17 of those kilometers would sit within the Webequie First Nation reserve boundaries. The actual area within which the road would be routed, the planning area essentially, is 2 kilometers wide. So this is a 2 kilometer wide band, which is known as the preferred corridor, running from the airport to the McFalls Lake area, and then so the road will be situated somewhere in that 2 kilometer wide band, this preferred corridor. The actual cleared area for the road is 35 meters. Um, there are three major water body crossings: the Winnisk Lake crossing, the first one running east out of the settlement area of Webequie First Nation, and the second being Winniskissis Channel, which is a 30 to 40 meter wide channel or crossing. And then the final major crossing is that of the Mukatai River at the east end of the project, almost right at the end of the road. And that's, again, another 30 to 40 meters in width as well. So it's more than just a two-lane road, gravel road, though. It will also include both temporary and permanent and aggregate pit and rock quarry areas. There will be equipment for processing, i.e., so for example, um, uh, crushing the rock to get it to the appropriate sizes to use for different purposes in construction. And then, of course, all those pits and quarries will need access roads, so you can get to them. The construction vehicles can get to them and pick up the materials, and those roads will also cross um, water courses like rivers and streams. So there will be crossings required along those access roads as well. Um, in terms of construction camps, um, these are temporary, and there have been four identified for along the 107-kilometer road, and these would consist of obviously bunkhouses for the construction workers. There would be other supportive facilities associated with them, as you can imagine, like a wastewater treatment plant and a storage area for drinking water. And then typically with associated with these construction camps are what you call storage and laydown areas for equipment and materials as well.
All
So
right. Don, you really sound like you know
yeah,
what you're talking about.
yeah, I've times
It's,
over the last
you,
couple of years, Jen.
yeah, you sound like you've done this before.
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. So let's now talk a bit about IK, Jen, and
Okay,
you know, and what is IK, and feel free to jump in. But the most important thing I think I would say about IK is that it's no one thing, right? It can take
right.
many different forms. Um, in a general sense, it represents that worldview that Indigenous people have. It's holistic. That means it takes into consideration many different factors and things, and they're all connected with each other in some way, right? And
That's right.
I like this description, like it's a body or collection of knowledge built up by a group of Indigenous people over generations, um, of living closely connected to the land. That's a pretty good definition of it, isn't it?
I think so. All of that knowledge
And
has been passed down, and as we look at changes to the land, that's also passed down. So all of our information is usually up to date.
yeah, and but again, like you said, it's always changing, right? Like
Hmm.
with it being passed down, it's also adjusted too, right? To reflect the way things are now. It's cumulative. It builds on top of the knowledge builds on top, like all knowledge, right? It builds on top of other knowledge. It grows with time. It doesn't get smaller, it gets bigger, right? And it's like I was saying before, it's always changing, as the economy changes, as the politics change, as the environment changes, spirituality changes, right? Over time. I mean, I you can testify to the fact that I'm in many Indigenous communities. Spirituality is coming back, right? Traditional spirituality is coming back.
That's right. In my community, for instance, we lost a lot due to Indian residential schools, and we've been working really hard at reclaiming many of our ceremonies along with our language. So that's something that's important to note too. And we were talking about Indigenous knowledge, and I like that, we say it's holistic and always changing with social, spiritual, environmental, political, and economic changes. So, we look at such a broad lens for hunting, harvesting, fishing, cultural, and ceremonial uses as well. And sometimes it's nice just to go for a long walk in the bush and just sit somewhere quietly. So that's a
Yeah,
lot of different things. And people will notice if you're out on the land often and you notice all the changes that happen, right? I remember when we were in Webequie um, the last time, everybody was talking about the way the ice has been changing. And so that's a part of
yes,
Indigenous knowledge.
yes. That's a great point. That was really interesting, wasn't it, Jen? And it's something that,
Hmm.
our team latched onto because, and that's one thing I've learned over the years, working with Indigenous communities is, the because because of their dependence and their tight relationship with the land, they're very observant, extremely observant, and and these observations are extremely helpful when it comes to things like trying to understand climate change. You can
Hmm.
do all the Western science in the world, but really some of the most important information can be gathered from community members, right? And you
Especially
and
since there's that. Go ahead. Sorry.
well, I was just going to say, you and I, when we were in Webequie a few months ago, sat down and talked to community members about what we're about climate change, right? And observations related to climate change. And ice was one of those that was absolutely universal, right? Is
I think
how
that
the
was a
ice is so,
big the hot topic, so to speak, for our
yep,
conversations because one of the things that that leads to is ensuring that everyone is safe that goes out in the wintertime, right? So there's areas that
yeah,
people warn others not to go on, or making sure people have radios and making sure that nobody goes out alone. So those are very
yeah.
important aspects.
Yes, it's absolutely a safety issue, and it has, the thickness of the ice has huge implications on transport of materials into the community during the winter, and the size of the loads, the weight of the loads that can be carried by trucks during that winter road season, right? If the ice isn't thick enough, then the loads have to be lighter, um, or the road can't even be open in some cases, right? If it's not thick enough. So huge implications on the community, things like that. So, I think that you're right. That ice thickness um, issue that was brought up was a big one, but a perfect example of IK. And I
Hmm.
mean, I know traditionally, non-indigenous people, when they think of IK, well, I know in our business, in the consulting business, the what we used to think of as IK almost exclusively was just the stuff that you could put on maps, right?
Hmm.
It was typically a map-based exercise. I mean, coming from a GIS background, I was involved in a number of projects, right, where you're mapping IK information, and it was really, that was really what it was limited to. It was, in terms of on projects, it was like, okay, get the IK information on the map. Well, it's not always mappable, right?
Well, that's right,
But the
because it
cut,
also feeds into the socioeconomic reports that we're also
yes,
working on. So it feeds into that
yes,
because when we look at socioeconomics, you're looking at kind of community profiles, the demographics,
yep,
the ages of people, how many people live in a house, and some of those things. But we also look at how IK or some of that sacred information is passed down through the generations. Is it being passed down? How is it being passed down? And how many language speakers are there? And what kind of reclamation activities are happening? So there's so
yep.
many different ways that we can look at IK.
Oh, it's so true. It's what else do I have on this slide here in terms of input from community surveys and focus groups, which is kind of what you're touching on, right? Descriptions of traditions, governance, decision making, how are decisions made, right? That kind of information. You're right. All that kind of stuff is collected, and it doesn't go on maps, right? But we're integrating that into our reports, and it helps, the technical staff get a better understanding of the community and how it operates. And then, of course, there's the stories and oral histories, which are amazing and so
Mhm.
interesting,
Those
right?
are some of my
And
favorite things to listen to.
oh yeah, they're incredible, right? So, and the challenge is collecting those, right, and making sure that record is not lost. And because unfortunately in Webequie we've seen a number of elders pass away in the last 6 months to a year, and the
Mhm.
hope is always that those stories have been captured, right, and properly documented and safeguarded. Um, let's move now and talk a little bit about the importance of IK to the assessment process, because traditionally, IK was kept in its own little section, often quite small, in an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. And I think that's changed significantly now, as both the federal and provincial governments, have expectations that, and rightfully so, that IK be weaved into all aspects of an impact assessment or an environmental assessment. So you're seeing that happening. I mean, it's a requirement to demonstrate that it has been it has been incorporated and used in the development of different sections of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. So it feeds into natural environment, it feeds into social and socioeconomics, it feeds into health. Um, so it's to be included, not just to inform an assessment. So
That's
its
right, and
role
it's
has
not
in
and it's no longer an afterthought, because that's one of the things
no,
I used to think about IK.
yes,
Um, it was, "Oh, yeah, by the way, we have some IK, we need to collect this," and it's kind of attached to this larger report, and in this case, it's not. It's everything is all
yep,
integrated and combined.
exactly. So why don't we move now, Jen, to give some examples, and hopefully this will
Okay.
help clarify things for community members. Let's give some examples looking at different sort of aspects of an environmental assessment, and I think this will help people understand this a little bit better. So let's start with fish and fish habitat. So the way I set this up was, just in terms of the kinds of questions that would be asked of community members to try and uh, extract, some of that information, that indigenous knowledge.
Mhm.
So the kinds of questions would be things like, what species of fish do you eat? Do you eat? Um, do you consume all of the fish or parts of the fish? In those parts that you don't consume, do you use them for other things? Right? Just understanding that kind of information, and drilling down is extremely helpful, right? Because even though it might be, for example, not a fish species at risk, it may be extremely important to the community. So it should have special
Right.
significance to, to the community, even if it doesn't scientifically, if you know what I mean. Um, and now, other questions might be, do you have specific areas where you fish? Have these areas changed over time, right? Again, you might be looking at things like climate change or whatever, right? If
Fluctuating
flows
water
have,
levels and stuff like that.
yes, exactly. Like if flows have changed on a water course, um, and now maybe spawning is occurring someplace else, like things change over time. Um, where are the spawning areas for the species that you eat? I remember when we were planning one of our fish habitat surveys, we were able to assemble a group of community members and talk to them about potential spawning areas for a particular species. I can't remember what it was, and it was so interesting because you had the Western scientists, right, the technical team, and they had the areas that, based on the characteristics of the stream, the areas that should be spawning areas for a specific species. And then when we gave it to community members, we let them tell us where they actually were, based on the fact that they're the harvesters, right? They're living
Based
off
on
off
in
the
real
land and
life,
water in real
LILR.
life. Yeah, and but the exactly. But the interesting thing was there was a lot of overlap, but there were also additional areas, right? So that helped sort of guide our work, which is fantastic. It's a perfect example of indigenous knowledge at work, and the integration of that with Western science, right? guiding guiding the project team in terms of how to do an effective survey that's actually representative, right, of how the land and waters are used. So,
Oh, I
other
think
questions might be.
it sorry, I'm just
Go ahead.
interrupting you, Don.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
I
go
think
ahead.
one of the
Absolutely.
important things to note too is that this information is not published publicly. So
No.
that's something we can incorporate into our reports, and then we also have data sharing agreements with other communities that provide what they will and what they would like to share. And so that's information that we're very, very careful with, and we make sure we follow a number of principles so that we don't own that information. Those of us who are
No.
carrying out these assessments, this information belongs to community.
Yeah, that's right. It's protected. Um, it's all
Hmm.
protected information. We follow the lead of the community. The community typically understand that how important it is to share with us. Um, but we respect the fact that they don't really want it explicitly disclosed, right? They just want us to use it in doing our work and helping to
Hmm.
shape our work and helping to identify and develop assessments, right? Evaluations as well. So let's move now to another example. Then that would be wildlife surveys. The kinds of questions we might ask for this. So where do you typically find different species, right? Like where have you observed the caribou, right? At different times of year. Where are the caribou use areas? Where are the preferred hunting areas for the different species? Things like that. When do you hunt different species? And the reason why we might be asking that is well, I mean, one of the reasons is an operational reason, right? Is when we're doing our baseline studies, we don't want to interfere with traditional activities. Um, that's really important, and we want to time construction so that it doesn't interfere with traditional activities as well too. And another question that I have put together here was, where are the nursery areas for large mammals such as caribou and moose? Again, the our technical team can identify the typical characteristics of these areas, but community members know where these areas are. And so
That's right.
there isn't always a full overlap between, where they are in theory based on physical characteristics versus where they are in reality. So that's always
ILR.
interesting to see. Yes, yeah. No, ILR or IRL in
In
real
real
life,
Oh,
right?
IRL, yeah.
Yeah,
I
in
have a
real
backwards
life.
brain.
So I won't comment on that. That's too easy. So let's talk about visual impact analysis. And this is one that maybe people don't always think about, but it's actually part of an environmental assessment. And I think you were touching a bit on it before when you were talking about, sitting in the forest, sitting out in the bush by yourself quietly, just enjoying the experience, right? And that's what we're getting at with the visual impact analysis, right? Understanding how people get to where they hunt and fish. I mean, the hunting and fishing experiences, these aren't just going out and hunting and fishing. They're, to a large extent, they're spiritual experiences as well too, right?
Well, that's it. For instance, if someone's out and they have fasting ceremony areas, and you want it to be quiet because people are out there alone and in the quiet. It's meant to be quiet for however many days their commitment is.
Yes, exactly.
So
That's
you
a
don't
great
want to
example.
be near a bunch of traffic, a big loud truck or two going by every now and again. It would be a little jolting in the silence.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Not that
hard
it's really ever
to.
silent in the bush, though, right? Because if
No,
it's
it's never silent,
a
but it's a
nice
certain
season, yeah.
kind of background noise. Yeah, it's not. You're right. It's not definitely not silent, but yeah. I mean, it's so it's all about trying to understand how community, like the areas that they use, how they get there, and trying to understand. that it's an experience for them, right? And you don't want the project, in this case the road, to sort of impact that experience significantly, right? Take away from that experience. So because um, the landscape and how it appears is part of that experience, right? You want to preserve that landscape. You don't want to just um, change the visual impact of it significantly, and it's an important thing. It's not always something you can describe exactly. But like the other question I have here too is, are there special areas of your homeland, such as spiritual sites, where views of the landscape are especially important, right?
Hmm.
There are quite often vistas, right, or lookout points that
Right.
community members might have, right? And again, these are spiritually significant areas. And so, trying to preserve those areas, it's important to know about those areas to make sure that the road doesn't impact those areas too much.
Yeah,
So
you have
anyway,
to
that's
carefully consider where the road is going to go.
exactly right. And just to preserve that experience for community members. Let's move now to talk a little bit about noise impact analysis. Another one of these things, like visual impact analysis, that isn't always thought of. But what the question that I had put together was, are there specific areas where noise from the road could affect your enjoyment of traditional activities such as hunting, fishing, or spiritual experiences? And you talked about that. You actually gave that example,
Hmm.
Jen. The fasting, right? And the idea is it's meant to be a time for thinking or contemplation, right? And making those spiritual connections and you know understanding, people may do that typically in certain areas. It just depends.
And
But
certain
you
times of
don't want
year,
to
perhaps.
at certain times of year, but you don't want to impact that experience as well. So, and it's all about experience of being on the land or on the water. It's all about preserving culture. It's all about keeping that family cohesion or the bond between family members intact. And being able to pass that down over generations as well too. So noise, believe it or not, is a huge factor, that needs to be considered when it comes to IK. Um, Routing the road. Now let's go back to the earlier planning phases of this project, and there was a significant amount of work done looking at where this road should go, and the planned route is not a straight line, as most people
Hmm.
have probably seen, especially coming out of Webequie settlement area. It follows some crazy, curvy path, but there's a reason for that, and it's because community members sat down and looked at it, talked about it amongst themselves, and came up with a route that had the least impact on, for example, their spiritual experiences, or on hunting areas or fishing areas, right? So, there was a lot of thought that was put into that preferred corridor, um, and all these things were were brought to the table in terms of things, constraint areas that community members didn't want the road to go through, or to wanted
Hmm.
the road to avoid, right? So that was a big part. So it's, when you look at that route, it's got a lot of community input sort of baked into it. Um, and again, like the other question I had here was, are there important spiritual sites that need to be avoided? Um, Again, we take that information. It's important to us. Um, we factor that into our baseline studies. We factor that into routing the road, and in socioeconomics as well too. So that's another area. And then let's move now to climate change, which is a big one. So, has some of the questions I have here, and this is just a few of them. There could be many other questions, but one of the questions I had was, has the behavior of different wildlife species changed over time, right? What are you seeing out there? Community members are very attentive because they have to be, because hunting and fishing, harvesting in general relies on being able to look at patterns in animal movement and behavior, right? And if you want to be successful and if you want to fill your freezer, you got to pay attention. And so that's why, speaking with community members, you learn a lot about animal movement and behavior at different times of year and different types of weather, things like that. Um, and then another question was, has um, this change in behavior of different wildlife species, has it caused you to make adjustments to when and where and how you hunt and fish as well? Um, and then when you brought this up earlier, Jen, like, has there been a change in, like, a noticeable change in water levels over time?
Hmm.
Um, has this caused you to change how you harvest, right, and where you go, and what you do, or what species you're targeting? What impact has that had? Um, and then changes in the winter road season, right? This, we talked a little bit about this before. Has it become shorter? You know, not only shorter, but has the time within which you're able to bring in the heaviest possible loads gotten shorter too? All
And
these,
travel
have there been
time,
more travel
because
time? Yes, travel
I
time
heard on
increased.
some of the roads this past winter, over the winter, there's still snow out, but you couldn't travel on the winter roads during the day because it was a little
Okay,
too
yeah.
mushy. Mhm.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, because the day-night temperature difference, right? Yeah. Maybe it's become more significant now than before. It's hard. I mean, I'm just speculating, but these are the kinds of things that have to be considered. Climate change is a huge one, Jen, isn't it? Like, it's such a source of
Absolutely.
information, sitting and talking to community members about climate change, because they always have stories to tell, right? They always do. And of course, they can also recount stories that they learned from previous generations, right? That have been handed down, just so that, to help you sort of understand that broad timeline of change. Let's
Well,
talk a
that's
bit about
it. Because I
Go
was
ahead.
just gonna get into some vegetation. Because while we were in
Oh,
community
were you?
too, we heard, about the changes to some of the vegetation, and in particular, the berry areas. So some of the berry areas have changed, and some particular berries are further away from the community than ever have been before. And then I would imagine too, with the water levels changing, that some of those
Yeah.
medicines that we would gather from around the shorelines would be changing as well, right? So there's a lot of those kinds of changes when we're considering Indigenous knowledge and changes to the land with respect to climate change.
I remember, Jen, when we heard those stories about the berries, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
because they were saying the water levels were higher, and so they had to go to different areas. I remember that. That was really interesting, because all these traditional areas that had been used for berry picking, um, had shifted somewhat, right? Whether it's,
Yeah, I was
you know,
asking about cloudberries.
oh yeah,
And
yeah, okay,
so
I remember
and
that
so
now.
some
Yes,
some had said, "Well, we picked them when we were young, but we haven't seen them."
yeah, interesting. So there you go, like an entire species that's not seen anymore, right? Interesting. Yeah,
Maybe just
yeah,
further
let's
away.
or further away, right? Yeah, but yeah, those are the kinds of questions you would ask. Like, what plants are important to the community, whether it's for medicine or for food? Um, how do community members use these different plant species? We've had a number of meetings with community members where we talked about, um, what plants do they use? Why do they use them? For medicinal purposes, what are different plants used for? Really interesting stuff, and it's all part of the work that we're, that the studies that we're doing. the human health risk assessment studies
Mhm.
that we're doing as part of the environmental assessment as well. So lots to talk about, Jen. Really interesting topic. I mean, we could talk about this for multiple episodes, and I'm sure we'll
Oh God,
we'll
we could.
revisit it again soon, won't we? Yeah. So that wraps up today's discussion, Jen, of how Indigenous knowledge is used in environmental and impact assessments. We hope this was helpful and encourages you to join us again next week at the same time, when we talk about the preliminary results of the caribou studies. Um, don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, supplyroad.ca. And we will talk to you again next week, won't we, Jen? Miigwech.
We sure will. Miigwech and Bamapi.